Welcome to Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release, a podcast dedicated to licensed wildlife rehabilitators and the veterinarians who support them. I'm your host, Gail Buhl. This episode, I had the privilege to have a conversation with Dr. Katie Haman. She's the Wildlife Diversity Veterinarian for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. I first met Dr. Haman in 2023 at the Washington Wildlife Rehabilitators Association conference. She was speaking on the concept of One Health. Now, I was trained as a naturalist, and we were taught, and we always taught, that everything is connected. But the One Health concept really gives more detail and depth on how we are all connected. Let's get into it. I get to talk to Dr. Catherine Haman, and I'm going to let her explain her origin story in a second, but I'm very excited because I did see a presentation she did at the Washington Wildlife Rehabilitators Association conference last fall and was so intrigued and impressed. I did ask her to come on so everybody can be intrigued and impressed. So welcome, Dr. Haman. Really happy that you're here today.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here as well.
Well, for everybody who doesn't know you, I wonder if you could share with everybody your origin story, I call it. How did you get to where you are right now?
That is a very good question. I grew up in Georgia. I grew up on a farm in Georgia, on a very small family farm. Didn't know that I wanted to be a vet growing up. I actually started my college experience, I guess, thinking I was going to go into Middle Eastern studies and work in diplomacy or something, in the foreign services world. And that was very much my track until about my sophomore year of college. My dad is a commercial fisherman, and I didn't know what to do with myself one summer. And he said, "Hey, I have some friends who run a shrimp boat and they're doing some work on sea turtles. You should volunteer with them." And I was like, okay, I know nothing about
Why not?
sea turtles. I wasn't even in biology. Like, sure, I'll do that. And as part of they're doing a big health assessment study on sea turtles off the coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And a couple of wildlife veterinarians from the Wildlife Conservation Society came out on the ship to do some of the health assessments. And I realized that was a career option and was just completely blown away of, the potential that exists within, the world of wildlife medicine and wildlife conservation. And so it totally changed the trajectory of my career. I became really good friends and colleagues with Dr. Terry Norton, who's a very close friend and mentor of mine, and shifted gears and, started studying biology and chemistry and all of the prerequisites to go to vet school. When I graduated from my undergrad, I asked Dr. Norton for a recommendation to vet school, and he said no. And I was completely heartbroken. I was like, why on earth would you say no? You're my friend and colleague. His response was, well, you need to go live a little, because when you go to vet school, that's going to be the end all of your career, and that's what you'll be focused on, and you won't have time to go do the field work and get these great experiences. So come back to me in 5 years and I'll write your recommendation. So in the meantime, I got a master's in marine biology and then worked as a field technician kind of all over the world. I worked on some tall ships. I got to spend time in Antarctica for several seasons and really just spent time learning about ecosystems, mostly marine ecosystems, because I was really focused on marine biology, but just learning about ecosystems and the animals that live within them and the people that live and work and recreate in those systems as well, which really helped kind of tie it all together for me when I did come back and finally decide to apply for vet school and go to vet school, and then, end up where I am now as a wildlife veterinarian with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Wow. So a couple follow-up questions there. Were you thinking that Dr. Norton's advice was like crazy at first?
Yes.
Yes.
I definitely was. I was, I think I was pretty upset with him. I mean, it's been 25 years now, but I was pretty upset with him at the time. And I've since gone back and thanked him for making me wait, because I think I probably would have landed in a very different path of veterinary medicine if I hadn't taken those years to
Right.
see the world and
Right.
learn more about different systems.
Well, it certainly says a lot about you that you took his advice because, of course, he was a trusted mentor and everything. It's also a shout out, and people who listen know that I'm
Mhm.
such an advocate for finding mentors that can really
Mhm.
help you along the way. And that certainly sounds
Absolutely.
like exactly what you had. The other thing
Absolutely.
is that we never know where we might be caught, right? You know,
Hmm.
you volunteered for a summer and it just opened up your whole world in a completely different way,
Totally.
unexpectedly, but you listened to it. That's the other
Hmm.
thing is you listen to yourself saying, wow, this is amazing. I need to pursue it. Even if it's a completely different track, maybe a lot
Hmm.
harder. Don't even know, but I know that this is my life's work is in this
Hmm.
direction. So
Yeah.
kudos to you because that's
And kudos to
hard.
my dad for getting me on that shrimp boat.
Now, have you ever talked to your dad about like, was he just really thinking it was just like, I need to give her something to do for the summer? Or was it like, she might be kind of interested in this more than she thinks?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I don't know. I've never had that conversation with him. I've said thank you,
Uh-huh.
definitely, but I've never asked, "Hey, did you know that this would, or did you suspect that this would
Right.
change the course of my life?"
Right. Wow. Just so fun to kind of contemplate. And
Yeah.
I am so happy you took this path.
Yeah, me
By the
too.
way, just
Well, I
to
met
say.
my husband in Antarctica, so who knows, right? If I had stayed in Middle
Right.
Eastern studies, I may have a very different life.
Exactly. Exactly. It is fun to contemplate, not
Hmm.
to like regret or anything like that, but just kind of
Totally.
like, huh,
Hmm.
this is so different than it would have been. So, oh my gosh, thank you so much for sharing that. So today we're going to talk about kind of what I'm calling the primer on One Health. Just to kind of get everybody on the same page, what is One Health?
The simple definition of One Health, it's this idea that the health of people is interconnected with the health of the environment and the health of animals. And if you look up One Health, you'll see like the triad, right? Where you have
Hmm.
the bubble of human health and the bubble of environmental health and the bubble of animal health, and where they overlap is considered One Health. I will say that I am not an expert in One Health. There are definitely, there are people out there who've spent their entire careers dedicated to this field of One Health.
Hmm.
From my perspective, I think of One Health as kind of an approach and a framework for addressing some of the really complicated, really difficult problems that we face today with climate change and animal health and animal welfare. And it's really this collaborative effort from multiple disciplines working together in a multidisciplinary approach to solve some of these problems and to try and have novel approaches to addressing some of the issues that we're facing.
Hmm.
And so if you think about it from the bigger picture, it is incredibly complicated, right? It's many different sectors and areas of research and different fields that all work together, hopefully work together to try and promote this concept of One Health
Hmm.
for the entire planet.
When you say the three pieces, I just want to clarify because I think that I have been misunderstanding part of
Mm-hmm.
it. So it's humans, the environment, and then animals. Now,
Mm-hmm.
animals includes livestock and wildlife,
Mm-hmm.
or okay. I
Yep.
didn't know where wildlife fit, if it fit in the
Mm-hmm.
environment section or if it fits with just the
Mm-mm.
umbrella of
Yeah,
animals.
the animal section, yeah, definitely includes, all animals. So wildlife, marine and terrestrial species, domestic
Mhm.
animals, farm animals, all animals basically. And then the environment side is the habitat and basically the ecosystem itself in which those animals and humans are living.
The concept of One Health, when I first started hearing about it, I'm like, a lot of my training is being a naturalist. And
Mm.
naturalists forever have been saying everything's connected, people. Everything's
Yes.
connected. So it is, for me, incredibly satisfying seeing that a lot more people are like, yes, and putting a framework to it, right?
Hmm.
Not just saying,
Hmm.
we're all connected, and if we affect something over
Hmm.
here, we're pretty sure we're going to affect something over there. But this is putting a framework to it, so I
Right.
really appreciate that. So there are what I'm calling companion definitions. So you have a broad definition of One Health, but what about One Welfare, for example, too?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a general definition for One Welfare?
Yeah, definitely. And One Welfare is newer. The term, well, the concept and framework of Welfare is definitely newer on the scene than One Health. One Health has been around, well, as you mentioned, One Health technically has been around forever, and a lot of the indigenous and native entities have recognized the importance of One Health
Right.
before it got this Western definition. But One Welfare is the concept that basically animal welfare, the welfare of the environment, and the biodiversity itself are all very interconnected to the human well-being. And so for me, in my mind anyway, so the concept of One Welfare and One Health go hand in hand. One Health doesn't really take into account the welfare aspects for animals. I think it would fall into the human component of One Health, but by and large, when when we're looking at One Health and frameworks within One Health, we aren't really thinking about the welfare of the animals themselves, right? We think about their health and we think about whether or not they may have a disease or nutritional status, things like that, but we don't think about the welfare itself of that individual, which I think is incredibly important, right? Because even for humans, we are deeply connected to animals. And so appreciating their welfare and having a framework that addresses the welfare of the animals themselves is, I think, very beneficial. Right now, the One Welfare approach is very much focused on farm animals and food production, which is understandable. But I think it's also a fantastic approach to consider for wildlife, because we frequently don't think about the welfare of our wild animals. I mean, we do if we're capturing them and handling them, right? And we're having like direct human interactions with them. A Caspian tern out on the beach, we don't think about the welfare aspects associated with that animal facing climate change and food shortages and things that may impact the individual wellness and welfare for that animal, and then how that would be translated to the population.
You just pretty much answered my question. I think that One Welfare can focus down to the individual, whereas kind of the One Health might look at the individual, but it's really about the larger picture, the larger umbrella of what's going on. So using, of course, the individuals as parts of populations, and because that's where we get a lot of our information is from the individual. That's very helpful. And I do know that like when we talk about animal welfare, a lot of people are now starting to call it animal wellness. And it is not just about captive livestock and captive wildlife, but it is just, as you mentioned, a free-ranging wildlife as well. So that's such an interesting concept to me because especially in rehabilitation, we're often told by lots of entities, let nature take its course, and nature's not always nice. And, trying to figure out when to intervene and not to intervene is a hard thing. It's an interesting line. And everybody draws that line in slightly different places. So importance of One Health. We've kind of defined it. What's the importance?
To me, and in my, personal opinion and in my job, I think it's of utmost importance. I think it is really the framework by which we can address, some of these, what I call wicked problems, right? That are just very, very complicated and complex problems. I think the One Health approach provides a really solid framework for trying to address those problems and trying to bring in a multidisciplinary team of individuals and entities, not just individuals, to address those problems. And so I think it is very important, although I do think it has its limitations. And one of my biggest beefs with One Health is that it's very human centric. Humans are very selfish and we're very focused on ourselves and how everything affects us. And One Health is definitely more focused on the human health, human wellness side of it. And I think that that's very limiting. And I would love to see, with time, I'd love to see that change. And I think it will, because I think with climate change is a great example, or highly pathogenic avian influenza is a really great example, that it may be impacting wildlife more, physically and physiologically by causing mortality, but the emotional impact on humans is really quite large as we watch these events happen.
Right. So do you think, and this might be going way down a rabbit hole we may have to come back out of, but when you think about the recent, SARS-CoV-2, COVID,
Hmm.
suspected that it probably came from bats, that kind of thing. And certainly a lot of diseases that we end up getting for some
Hmm.
reason usually come from wildlife, right?
Right.
So do you think things like that then would help people broaden their view or focus it even more on humans?
Both. How's that
Both.
for a
Yeah, and
non-answer?
that's the best answer. Because when I
I think.
heard when we were, all the information was starting to come out, and it's like, oh,
Hmm.
and I'm a specialist in bats, bat
Hmm.
rehab, and so I'm like, oh my gosh, not bats, please not be
Hmm.
bats, because of course the stigma associated with bats and the myths and everything like
Right.
that. And I'm like, oh,
Right.
here's one more thing that people are going to hate about bats or be
Hmm.
scared of them or whatever. So that's why I was
Hmm.
wondering, is
Hmm.
that for the general public, not rehabilitators, but the general
Right.
public, if it would make it harder.
Right. And I think in some ways it definitely does. Right. But I also think in some ways it makes it's very much in our face, right? Of
Hmm. Hmm.
how we're harming the environment and how we're, basically breaking down barriers that used to serve as protection for, preventing the overlap of these pathogens from, say, a bat to a human or
Right.
some other animal that might be, in a wet market or
Right.
otherwise exposed to a human in situations that it naturally wouldn't be. And so I think that's a really important message
Hmm.
associated with it, right? Is that sure, animals carry zoonotic diseases that we should be concerned about, but more importantly, we should be concerned about how what we're doing to break down the barriers that naturally protect humans from those diseases being
Hmm.
transmitted.
Hmm.
And so I think the message goes hand in hand.
Okay. And then just because I'm in the rabbit hole. Um, so I'm also thinking about livestock coming in contact with wildlife, actually passing diseases to wildlife, and
Hmm.
then it turns around, and then of course the wildlife passes it back to the livestock, and then of course what
Hmm.
do humans do? Blame the wildlife when it wasn't the wildlife that started the whole thing. So I'm assuming that this framework would also help with looking at those kind of and
Hmm.
some of those are pretty wicked problems too.
Hmm. Yes,
But
definitely.
so okay, I just want to make sure I'm assuming things.
Yep. I'll put a plug in here for the importance of wildlife rehabilitators and helping
Hmm.
with that framework and that education of the general public, right? Because as you mentioned, there's a lot of stigma against rehabilitating some species, right?
Right.
Well, many species, I think, but it's also a public service. And if a private citizen sees a squirrel that's been hit by a car and is suffering, they want someone to help that animal. And that's where wildlife rehabilitators come in. They're providing this public service
Right.
that really builds upon the trust of the public with people who work in the realm of wildlife health.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
think because of that, and because most wildlife rehabilitators do have such a tremendous connection to their community, they really stand on the forefront of helping educate people, right? And helping really make sure that the general public is learning about how complicated these things are and that the wildlife isn't necessarily passing this disease back
Right.
to a livestock, or a cow or something. It may be, they can really educate about the whole cycle and how the barriers have been broken down and, climate change and habitat destruction and all of these things
Exactly.
play a really important role. And I think that, at least in my experience, in a lot of ways, the general public may be a lot more likely to listen to wildlife rehabilitators that are an integral part of their community than they are to a government entity, who
Yeah.
they may have conflict with for a variety of reasons. And so
Hmm.
I think that the role of wildlife rehabilitators in this One Health framework is so incredibly important.
Well, I'm so happy you mentioned that because I know that all rehabilitators know, we are doing a public service, right? A community
Hmm.
service. But the other thing is at least in Minnesota, a rehabilitator often can spend a lot more time, for example, on the phone or face to face with the finder of an
Hmm.
injured animal or orphaned animal. And so maybe answering those questions, where the state agency just does not have the time. They can't do
Yep.
that. And so then they fall back on the
Absolutely.
old standby, just let nature take its course. Well, here's some
Hmm.
rehabilitators you can call, but it gives the
Yeah.
impression that they don't care, which is not true. But
Hmm.
when you're a finder and you're in this emotional space because you want to help this animal and you're in distress because you're trying to
Hmm.
figure out what to do, that I think you're right. It does help build trust.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think you can get a lot of really good information out. And it's a
Hmm.
point where finders, because they have an emotional investment in that particular animal, it leaves them actually open to education.
Right.
And sometimes they call and they're irritated because they've been talking to 13 people and they just need you to do something.
Hmm.
But most of the time they're pretty open to your suggestions and trying to get help for the animal, etc. So thank you for saying
Yeah,
that.
that's a great point.
Yeah. So, and we'll maybe pick that up again a little bit later in the conversation about how rehabilitators can really interface intentionally in this One
Hmm.
Health world, because I
Hmm.
think we should. One of the questions I had when we were thinking about putting this episode together is, what determines health? And that may be way too big for what we're going to talk
Yeah.
about. But even
Right.
if there's some high level, 30,000
Hmm.
feet level points about what determines that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I laugh because it's a very complicated question.
Uh-huh.
And I feel
Uh-huh.
like it's a question I've spent a vast majority of my career kind of beating my head against. And to me, that is also one of the key weaknesses in this One Health approach, and well, the term One Health, right? And defining it as One
Mm-hmm.
Health is, how do you define health? And I think for humans and in the human health world, it's pretty clearly defined, and there's a whole lot of variables and a whole lot of determinants
Mm-hmm.
of health
Mm-hmm.
that play into that. But for wildlife specifically, it's very difficult to define wildlife health. And again, if we look back at the human health side of things for kind of guidance here, health is a lot more than disease itself, right? Or the presence of a
Mm-hmm.
pathogen. It takes into account the complete mental well-being and the capacity to deal with things that are thrown at you and the ability to be fully resilient. But we don't really think about that in terms of wildlife health. By and large, the field of wildlife health unfortunately, has relied on sick and dead animals, right? We tend to
Right.
find dead wildlife, um, necropsy it, and that's what we use to determine the health of a population. But it's incredibly biased, and it's pretty much only focused on pathogens or nutritional status. It's not
Sure.
this bigger, more comprehensive picture of what wildlife health might be. And for better and worse, health is the term health in wildlife is a very commonly used term in management, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if you look at state management plans or the missions for many state governments,
Mm-hmm.
health is mentioned many times to maintain healthy populations of fish and wildlife, but they never define what that means. And so I think that
Uh-huh.
that is a key weakness, is
Uh-huh.
how do we set up quantifiable, measurable variables that would help us indicate whether or not a population is healthy and therefore likely to be resilient. And I do believe that relying on the dead piles to define that is not accurate. We're not going to be able to define healthy wildlife populations by simply relying on things that are dead.
Right. It's like using a flashlight in a stadium
Mm-hmm.
that's all dark. And if you had
Yes,
all the lights
exactly.
on, you might see things and experience things
Mm-hmm.
that you cannot with just the flashlight, right? So do you
Yep.
have like some examples of how kind of this One Health framework kind of
Mm-hmm.
might work and
Mm-hmm.
how it's working so far? And
Yeah, and this is me totally stealing work that other people have done.
no, that's
But
okay
there's a
to bring forward some great work. That's good. That's
yeah.
great.
So there's a paper by Ritwak et al. From 2019 that looks at a determinants of health model or framework
Hmm.
for wildlife, basically.
Hmm.
And this is some work that Craig Stevens, who is a wildlife veterinarian, an epidemiologist out of British Columbia, he's a brilliant, brilliant person and has spent the vast majority of his career trying to expand our approaches to wildlife health and wildlife
Mm-hmm.
medicine and conservation. And so the determinants of health model really tries to get at this core problem of health being a common but vaguely defined management goal for wildlife populations, and really tries to expand health to being, and this is a quote from Ritwak et al., to quote, the ability or capacity to realize full function and satisfy daily needs and adapt to or cope with a changing environment.
Wow.
So, in a nutshell, to be
Yep.
resilient. I think there's 12, maybe 13 determinants of health for human health. And it's the basic stuff that you would expect, right? So, income, education, like
Mm-hmm.
social aspects, right? That all play into the overall picture of human health, right? Your
Mm-hmm.
gender, your culture, um, childhood development, access to healthcare, things like that
Mm-hmm.
really play into human health and determinants of health. And from a human health perspective, they use this determinants of health framework to really define, right, where there may be risks, where management actions can be implemented to help mitigate those risks. And so this Ritwak et al. Paper took a fish, I think it was sockeye, and caribou, so two,
Oh.
fish species and a wildlife
Mm-hmm.
species, and then worked with experts of those species to review the determinants of health and to see if they would apply to those two species. And what they found is that yes, they are really good representations of how we might also address what fish and wildlife health. They did a network analysis to try and identify where key variables may, or key determinants, I guess, may be, the most important. Um, and so in my work here with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and our bat biologist, Abby Tobin, we've taken it a step further. And for bats, anyways, we did this determinants of health approach where Abby, because she's got this tremendous wealth of knowledge about bats, was able to just
Mm-hmm.
kind of fill in what the determinants are and then what the risks are that would be affecting those determinants. And then we took a step out of that and tried to apply actions that we might be able to take that would therefore, impact, hopefully, remove or reduce the risk to the determinant of
Sure.
health itself.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so I think it provides, in my mind, it provides a really cool framework for approaching this One Health problem
Mm-hmm.
with, specifically focusing on wildlife. But it does, in my mind, provide a really neat framework itself for addressing these things.
Yeah, that is so helpful, right? To get direction. I mean, this is huge. While you were talking, I'm thinking, okay, there's what, 1,400 species of bats in the world. If you're looking at ungulates or you're looking at fish, there's all these different species. If you're doing this work in Washington, how does it get out to the larger, whether it's the United States or even farther than that,
Mm-hmm,
right? To
mm-hmm,
and sometimes those machinations work very slowly until they don't, until
mm-hmm,
you get enough momentum and they go fast, right? But
mm-hmm,
so yeah, all those things were running through my head as you were talking about
mm-hmm,
that. But that is an amazing. I can't wait to read that paper.
mm-hmm.
Any other like on the ground? Have you been involved in projects or something that you were bringing in other folks from different disciplines or things like that, kind of moving toward that One Health?
I think in general, many, and I'm going to speak from the perspective of a wildlife veterinarian working in a management agency because
Mm-hmm.
that's all I know.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think a lot of management agencies are boots on the ground doing this work already.
Right.
We just aren't calling it One Health. I do think maybe several decades ago we weren't having this more holistic approach, and wildlife veterinarians with agencies maybe 15, 20 years ago were really there for captures and animal handling and the
Sure.
access to drugs and stuff. My experience within Washington with the Department of Fish and Wildlife here has been much broader than that, where I am brought into many conversations to be the health expert, figure out how to take samples and
Mm-hmm.
assess health of a population. But it's also kind of a bigger picture conversation as well. And I think about, our approach to Western pond turtles here in Washington, where I've been at the table for conversations about habitat restoration and where, if we're going to expand populations, where do we expand the populations to, and how do we assess quality habitat to reflect good health, right? And so I think that there is definitely a recognized role for wildlife veterinarians in those conversations with management agencies. And it's fantastic. And I think that the agencies themselves don't market it as a One Health approach. And I absolutely think we should be. And we could, right? Because I think the general public would get it. They would, especially after the pandemic, the general public has at least, a preliminary understanding of what One Health might be. And so I think we could, say, hey, we are doing One Health. We sit down together, with biologists and habitat specialists and hydrologists and a virologist. And we talk about how this virus, as an example, making it up, this virus may move between fish populations. And that is a One Health framework, right? Within that fish and that marine ecosystem. It is a One Health approach to understanding that.
Right. And if you already are practicing that, at your agency, for example, that you're bringing in all these people, to me, it lends itself, like, if there is an emergency, you got relationships with these people, you can bring them in very, very quickly if you need to and get some information. But it also, of course, brings in their expertise, but you're bringing in all the people or papers or knowledge and all that background that they have. Oh, I don't know, but I know somebody who does. And, oh, have we thought about this? Maybe an idea kind of almost off the wall, but it might be very valid.
Yeah. And I think that you just hit the nail on the head exactly for our response to highly pathogenic avian influenza. And I can speak to Washington. I'm sure many other states have been the same, but it was exactly that type of approach, right? Where this foreign animal disease that has huge economic implications for domestic agricultural and farmers and everything like that. It also has huge human impacts, right? All of the people that rely on the chickens and the domestic poultry for an income and their livelihood, or they have backyard chickens that are dear pets. And then, you bring in the wildlife rehabilitator component that's seeing all of the sick and dead wild birds coming in, and the public health aspect and the Department of Agriculture aspect. A really great example was the Caspian tern mortality event that we had here in Washington that was on a very public beach with a very heavily used campground right across the water from it, and the height of the summer, right? In Washington State on the coast, where people are very much there. And tackling that and understanding what the true human health risks are. What should our management actions be? What are the risks to domestic poultry in the area? What are the risks to the marine mammals? How do we clean this up? There's a crab fishery and a clam digging beach right there. Is there a human health concern to that? And then focusing on the seabird component, how many Caspian terns we were losing, what the impact was on that breeding population, as well as the entire flyway. It really highlights this overall One Health component that goes far beyond just human health.
Exactly. So shifting just slightly, but wildlife rehabilitators and the veterinarians that work with them, or veterinarians that are wildlife rehabilitators, it flows back and forth a little bit. This is a several part question. How can we apply some of these concepts? Are there places certainly that we can learn more? How do we figure out, that's a question mark, how to interface with other One Health professionals, whether it's the regulatory agencies or others? And how can we, as rehabilitators, we are already doing maybe some of the work, but doing the work intentionally, right? Toward this. So multi-part, you can take whatever you want, or all of it.
Yeah, that's a complicated question. I like to think of it, and this goes back to the talk I gave that you mentioned at the WWRA here in Washington. So the determinants of health is a framework, I think, for helping us understand really complicated problems. You take something that's got 18, 19 different massive threats, and you can put it on a diagram so you can look at it in a single page. And I think that's useful in itself, but then how do you actually take action, right? Where do you work there? And this is another concept that I've, kind of taken from Dr. Craig Stevens, and am promoting from work that he's done is this, basically applying the continuum of care to this approach as well, so that you can think about where you take your action.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of us that are trained medical professionals or work in wildlife rehabilitation, I think the continuum of care is probably pretty familiar, right? Where you have this like proactive health promotion side all the way out to the promote recovery reactive side.
Mm-hmm.
And in between there, you have like risk prevention, risk reduction, and taking actions. And so it's a continuum, right? So you can act on the proactive side, you can act on the reactive side. And I think wildlife rehabilitators act across the whole continuum of care, honestly. I think most probably know very well that they are acting in the reactive side, right? They're taking in animals, they're helping them get better and releasing them. They probably don't really think or appreciate how much they are working and the proactive side of that as well, which I think circles back to the conversation, we were having a few minutes ago about educating the general public. But I think by and large, wildlife rehabilitators are on the front lines. And so, they at least here in Washington, they frequently will be like, hey, Katie, I have a whole lot of sick something. I think something's going on. They tell me what's happening because they really are on the front lines. And I rely very much on our wildlife rehabilitators for that collaborative relationship. And so with time, as we start to understand these baselines, right, and then where things may kind of pop up outside of the norm, I guess, we can start to understand and think about, where can we act to be more proactive? Can we vaccinate, right? Can we apply some management actions that are going to help the determinants of health and help these animals be more resilient? And wildlife rehabilitators, I think, play a key role in that, especially, partnering with wildlife management agencies, universities, and folks doing wildlife health research. I think really should be tapping very closely into the wildlife rehabilitators because they're on the front lines. For being proactive, in my mind, one of the biggest steps we can take to be really proactive is education and outreach, right? Because once a disease is on the landscape, we're just going to be reactive. There's no way to do anything but be reactive. But we can educate people about not transporting animals across state lines or not releasing that pet turtle they have or, things like that. And I think that education is, in my mind, one of the key things here that we can really help teach the public how to be stewards of One Health. And wildlife rehabilitators have a direct access to that because they are trusted members of a community that I believe, will be listened to.
This is more internal to the workings of wildlife rehabilitation. If you've got an animal that needs antibiotics, for example, that you're very careful with that, if and when, and if you can, if it's a hunted animal, those kinds of things. I think that's, to me, seems to be very much One Health, that we're taking care of this animal, but we're also trying to take care of the whole. And we don't want bacterial resistance and all of those other kinds of things. And we definitely don't want antibiotics that don't work anymore because for whatever. So I think that's another thing. And it just, I've been in rehab for a very long time and it has changed so much for the better, right? That we've gotten more and more information and become more sources of best practices and more science and all of these kinds of things to not only help the individual, but to help the population. And even individual rehabilitators like myself. I think we all need to take a step back and just listen to what other people are doing and trying to figure out how we can fit in to that piece of the puzzle. Public education and that public service, I also agree with you, is one of the number one things that we do to help wildlife.
I will also add in, it's not fully proactive, right? It's on a sliding scale, but if you think about harm reduction, right? So the pathogens on the landscape, now we're just trying to reduce the overall harm. We're not fully reactive phase. We're kind of before that. I think rehabilitators also play a very important role there because they are doing treatments and they are rehabilitating these animals and they are learning more about the clinical signs and how to treat the species, right? Which veterinarians frequently don't get their hands on. And so I think there's a really key component of conservation there as well, where it may not have population impacts, right?
Hmm.
right now, but in say 10 years when there's some novel disease that comes out and I don't know wipes out I don't know some super common species, right? Raccoons,
Sure.
right? They're very common and we don't really think much about them right now, but who knows, in 10 or 15 years they might
Right.
not be as common. And I
Hmm.
think in those scenarios, relying on the information that wildlife rehabilitators have gathered over decades of working with that species and conducting basic treatments and keeping them, the husbandry and welfare of keeping them in captivity is incredibly important. And
Right.
so I also think that that is an often overlooked, but yet very, very important component for what wildlife rehabilitators contribute to wildlife health and conservation.
So, anybody who's listened to this podcast knows that I have pushed this and I bring it up anytime I can, and did three podcast episodes on the wildlife rehabilitation databases. Because most of that information that you were just talking about, unless they call you up, Katie, and say,
Mm-hmm,
"Hey, I've got these five whatever showing these kind of symptoms,"
mm-hmm,
then that information, unless they produce a paper, unless they work with somebody else, unless they
mm-hmm,
talk at a national conference, that information doesn't go anywhere.
mm-hmm.
It just stays there, and even
Right.
though we do year-end reports and things like that, often, I'm not speaking for every state,
Yeah.
but often that
True.
information
Yeah.
doesn't go anywhere.
No.
But these wildlife databases really give a chance for people who are doing research, for example, because they
Mm-hmm,
they clarify some of the variables, right? They reduce
mm-hmm,
that researchers would be looking for. And then on the back end, then the researchers can pull that information. And I don't know all the ins and outs of how they do that, but then looking for rodenticides and red-tailed hawks, then they can pull that information and then they're gathering it from a much bigger
mm-hmm,
pool of individuals that gives you
mm-hmm.
better information overall. So there's my plug for
So, yeah, and
for
it's
the
such a
databases.
phenomenal plug. It's such a phenomenal plug. I could not agree more. And I will, yeah, I'll just add to that plug too and say in Washington, we're working with Dr. Peter Rabinowitz, who's with the University of Washington's One Health Institute,
Hmm.
on a pilot project looking at, we have several of our wildlife rehabilitators have allowed him and his research team access to their data through the WRMD
Hmm.
management system. And his goal was to basically look at the trends over time to see if we can basically pick out early indicators of an event happening. And I know
Hmm.
that there's the First Alert platform that's built on top of the WRMD. The potential for that system is so cool. But you're absolutely right. The data have to be into a system that can be accessible for that type of work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just even thinking about like the HPAI, the avian influenza,
Mm-hmm.
that we're dealing with, that, USDA,
Mm-hmm.
that we're, they're of course testing all the poultry and all the domestics and all that kind of stuff. And then,
Mm-hmm.
certainly I don't want to say incidentally, because it's certainly been monitored in the wildlife too, but
Mm-hmm.
it is so overwhelming. They were
Yeah.
pretty overwhelmed. So facilities like the Raptor Center here in Minnesota made a case and was able to secure funding to be able to test every bird coming in alive or dead. And they've done it
Yeah.
since the
That's incredible.
beginning, specifically because we need data and we need data out there for everybody to use. The other thing that occurred to me when you were saying, the proactive versus reactive or things like
Mm-hmm.
that, one of the other things for the Raptor Center is that even if an animal, a great horned owl, for example, was found dead, they wanted it. And partly not just to test, but to get it off the landscape. Because we
Mm-hmm.
know in the case of avian influenza,
Mm-hmm.
so many scavengers have been exposed to the virus and have
Mm-hmm.
contracted the virus. And so that kind of helps with that One Health. Let's
Mm-hmm.
let's reduce it on the landscape as much as we can,
Definitely.
if we're able
Yep.
to.
I think one of the other questions that you had was interaction with One Health entities.
Yes.
Maybe from a rehabilitator's point of view of like
Hmm.
how would a wildlife rehabilitator contact or get involved with One
Right.
Health entities
Hmm.
doing One Health research or whatever it may be. And I can speak for Washington specifically, right? I just mentioned that UW, University of Washington, has the One Health Institute.
Right.
I think many universities have a One Health Institute. And I think, at least from my experience here in Washington, whenever I've communicated or worked with Dr. Peter Rabinowitz, he's just so incredibly excited to work with wildlife rehabilitators
Hmm.
because they are the boots on the ground and because they do see so many cases
Right.
of wild animals, right? And so really provide the opportunity to kind of get a really good data set, what we were just talking
Right.
about, of
Right.
what's out there. And so I think that, if a wildlife rehabilitator is interested, hey, maybe just Google One Health Institute for the university of the state that you're in, and you may find that there is one, and just reach out to the folks in that institute. I would be willing to bet that they'd be quite excited to have the opportunity to work with a wildlife rehabilitator.
That's a great pro tip. And again, I'm an independent wildlife rehabilitator, so I'm going to put this out there for independence because a lot of us do a lot of species of animal.
Yeah.
And so the trap we fall into as independents is what we do is too small. Doesn't matter.
Mhm.
I think it's great to reach out and kind of start developing a relationship, even if it doesn't turn in right away to any kind of,
Mhm.
collaborative action. It may down the road.
It very
And
well.
and so yeah, building those relationships,
Mhm.
getting in on some of those conversations.
Topics like biosecurity in face of SARS-CoV-2, right? We
Exactly.
know it's in
Hmm.
a lot of mammals in North America, so that could be a really great starting point of, hey, I'm an independent wildlife rehabilitator. I bring in X number of mammals. I Can we talk about biosecurity? Can we talk about, what I'm doing? Do you have recommendations? Would you be interested? Like, because I know that sometimes and I don't deal with the human health side of things, so I don't know
Hmm.
what the
Right.
legality is. But I know that there's sometimes interest in, symptom monitoring and testing and,
Oh, all
following
of that.
cases through.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
think that, that itself could be a really small starting point that could
Hmm.
lead to something much bigger.
Yeah. Great idea. Great idea. And that's an entry point too. If you're not
Hmm.
sure, like, I don't got
Hmm.
anything that no one would want to see, whatever, but you can ask a question like that. And most
Hmm.
people are very interested in helping. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I like that. And building relationships. I mean, a lot of the things that we've been talking about today is about building relationships. People who are in wildlife rehab or work at a zoo or other often say, I just want to work with animals. I don't want to work with people. But
I get that.
we all work with people.
Hmm.
Um, and
Yep.
luckily for us, most of the people that we're interfacing with are interested in animals, maybe not quite at the same level we are, but they're still interested in animals. So we have a commonality that we can
Hmm.
start working with. So that was a great pro tip, by the way, or what I would call a pro tip. Do you have anything else for wildlife rehabilitators or the veterinarians that are helping them?
I always want to say to wildlife rehabilitators and the vets working with them is like, don't sell yourself short. I feel
Hmm.
like for so long, wildlife rehabilitation and the folks who work in wildlife rehabilitation, be it the rehabilitators or the vets, have just been overlooked as like, oh, you're a backyard rehabilitator. But that's
Yes.
not true. As you mentioned earlier, I think it's a profession, and
Hmm.
it is a very well educated, extremely dedicated profession. And so I would just say advocate for yourself. I think that there is a growing movement within the world of wildlife health to accept wildlife rehabilitators as an incredibly important role in the world of wildlife health management and conservation.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, don't sell yourself short. Keep talking about all the good work you're doing and how you are a key component of One Health. Frankly, I don't think we would be addressing One Health from a perspective of wildlife health if it weren't for wildlife rehabilitators and the vets that they work with.
Wow. Dr. Heyman, I want to say thank you. Thank you. Thank you for so much for spending the time today to give us a primer on One Health and how wildlife rehabilitation fits in it and how we can maybe even go forward and fit more into it because we're not, yes, rehabilitators are about the individual animal, but really we're also about the health in the wild
Absolutely.
for all those pieces and parts we talked about with
Hmm.
One Health for humans, the environment, and animals. So, again,
Absolutely.
thank you so much. I cannot thank Dr. Katie Heyman enough for such a wonderful conversation. Wildlife rehabilitation is a part of One Health. As professionals, we should always be thinking of ways in which we connect into that system. This includes things like working with your local biologist, making sure we're using antibiotics and antiparasitics only when they're specifically warranted, and of course, there's many other things. All of our efforts are important for the animal in front of us, but also for the rest of the species in the wild. Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release is a production of Partners for Wildlife, working hand in hand with wildlife rehabilitators and veterinarians to improve the welfare of orphaned, ill, and injured wildlife. Our executive producer is me, Gail Buhl. I'm the Partnership Coordinator for Partners for Wildlife at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine's Raptor Center. To learn more about the Raptor Center and Partners for Wildlife, visit theraptorcenter.umn.edu. Our producer is Reese Rosado. Special thanks to our guest, Dr. Katie Haman, Partners for Wildlife, and the Raptor Center. That's our show. I hope you join us again next time.